water, hops, and malt. Praise be, German beer, a global triumph. From the Sumerians to the Middle Ages to the latest trends. German beer, protected for 500 years.
We passed the beer purity law.
It's a mark of quality.
Beer as popular today as ever. Beer an ever-present in changing times and even recommended by doctors. The favorite drink of the Germans and an export success the world over. A major brewery in the Sauerland region, one of the biggest breweries in Germany and the German world champion exporter for Pils. The private brewery has been family-owned for 9 generations and employs around 800 people. Brewer Michael Thon is one of them. He shows us how beer is brewed in this major brewery, just as in smaller enterprises, from delivery of the raw materials through to the bottling. The only materials needed for German beer are hops, malt, yeast and water. Those are the only ingredients permitted for brewing under the German purity law, Reinheitsgebot.
That is the harvested barley. It looks like that. These are the individual barley corns, which are processed into malt in the malt house. It's the malt that we use in brewing. The barley corn becomes the malt grain. For example, this is malt. To the eye, it's relatively identical with the barley corn. During malting, the barley corn is artificially induced to germinate by being immersed in water. The corn begins to sprout. After around 5 days, this germination process is stopped by drying the corn. It is the drying which causes the coloration in the malt. For example, this is a very light malt, a Pilsner malt. Other malts, such as Munich malt or black malt, are dried for longer. It's similar to toasting. The longer and the warmer the drying process, the darker the malt becomes, and as a result, it also influences the color of the beer subsequently brewed using the malt. So this is how the malt is supplied to the brewery. And in order for it to be used in the brewing process, the malt is then kibbled. In other words, it is milled down, like this. You can see that there are still parts of the outer leaves of the malt grain present in this milled material, and these are very important later on for the brewing process. And the white substance is starch, or more accurately, malt sugar, which is later converted to alcohol in the brewing process. The second major component in brewing beer is the hop. For beer brewing, only the female umbel is used, and the brewer is only interested in what is found in the hop umbel, lupulin, which is the yellow powder you can see here in the hop. The processed hops come in various forms. Today, as a rule, pellets are used. These are dried and pressed hops, for example, the part present as the umbel, pressed into small pellets. In addition, you can also find hop extract, which is the extracted form. The third component in beer making, and one which is also mentioned in the purity law, is water. Each brewery uses its own brewing water. These waters are very different and also contribute significantly to the character of the beer.
This rare film shows how large enterprises were already emerging in around 1900, making a profitable business out of quenching the thirst of the masses. The images show what the work in the malt houses was like during the heyday of industrialization. The barley, which has been immersed in water, is filled from the silos into light wooden trolleys and spread out to facilitate germination. The process for germination and subsequent malting has largely remained the same. The main difference is that back then, more manpower was needed, despite the repeated new industrial advances. Back to the present, the malt is delivered to the breweries several times a day. Thousands of tons of it are processed here every year to make beer. But before we get to that, the malt is examined carefully. Master brewer Jens Gruhl takes a sample before the malt is unloaded and takes a close look at it in the laboratory.
Well, at this point, the malt is examined before we unload it. The first check uses our senses. First we smell it. It has a typical smell, and it's not contaminated. The next step is to determine the water content. That's a quick test.
The water content in the malt must not exceed the permitted limit of 5%. This test too is passed. The malt grains can now be subjected to a strength test. The grains are tested for friability in the friabilimeter. At least 80% of the malt sample must be able to be milled to a fine dust. Even the size of the grains is checked using a sorting machine. The grain size is also important in achieving a consistent result when brewing. Although master brewer Jens Gruhl has many technical aids available to him, a good eye is equally important.
So now we take a look at these 1,000 grains, checking for grain from other plants and for any small stones.
No foreign grain eludes the trained eye of the master brewer, and this test too gives no cause for complaint. The malt complies with these high quality standards and can be unloaded. One floor lower, the malt is mixed with water and gently chopped in the wet kibbling mill in preparation for the actual brewing process. Grain has always been a set ingredient in beer. The first beer recipes have been handed down from the Sumerians and the Egyptians, so beer has been brewed for over 5,000 years. According to the oldest known recipe, written in cuneiform, the Sumerians used part-baked bread for their beer. Bread which was still moist inside, which is then mixed with dates or other spices and fermented in vessels with water. Following fermentation, it's filtered and left to stand for a number of days to mature, after which this historic beverage is ready to drink.
We've attempted to recreate a Sumerian beer here. Kash, the Sumerian beer, was originally made from a bread drink made from emmer, which is a type of grain which I believe practically doesn't exist today. Emmer is very similar to spelt. For that reason, we took a spelt loaf and broke it apart in water, which is what we have here. What can I call it? This liquid, shall we say? To it we added honey and cinnamon, as indicated in the recipe handed down, and you can clearly identify that in the aromas. There's a pleasant cinnamon tang. And then this is the fermented version. If it is left standing for long enough, the yeast finds a point of attack in the sugar of the bread to initiate fermentation. And once fermented, the honey and cinnamon taste is still present, along with a slightly alcoholic note. To make it drinkable for us, we really don't want to be drinking the solid bits of bread still remaining in the brew, so now we filtered it. Once filtered, this is what it looks like. It even has a relatively attractive color. It actually smells very pleasant. I'm excited to find out what it will taste like. In terms of the smell, of course, it's very, very bready, so not at all comparable with present-day beer. Okay, I would say that you can drink it. You can't compare it with beer in terms of how it tastes either. You can taste that there's alcohol in it, but that's the only aspect which can be compared to beer. It's extremely bready, although the cinnamon flavor is still just present. The honey note is detectable, similar to mead, for example, but I wouldn't recommend it for drinking or repeating.
In ancient times, there are said to have been between 12 and 20 types of beer. In Germany, there are over 5,000, and new beers are being added. Some new creations come from the country's beer capital, Munich, where tradition meets with modernity. On a far smaller scale than the big breweries, here Mario Hanel and Tim Schneguler manufacture their own craft beer. This trend, originating from the USA, refers to beer that is not produced for the mainstream. Craft beer brewers generally experiment with unusual beer styles and tastes, producing in small volumes. To discover this trend for themselves, the two friends first had to travel outside Germany.
The interesting thing was that you really had to find out about it abroad. In Germany, it was a bit like being locked away in your own world. The attitude was, Germany, the best beer in the world. You'll never find anything better. But when we went traveling in Australia and America, it was an eye-opener to see the variety of beers available there.
But in order to brew beer for sale in Germany, even craft brewers must comply with the purity law for every experiment they undertake. To still achieve new beer flavors, they choose unusual varieties of their ingredients.
Well, principally we have a selection here of a few special malts which we use along with the other ingredients. We source our malt from Germany for the most part, but we also have a malt house in the UK and one in Belgium for special malts which you can't really get in Germany. Here we have a special crystal malt from the UK known as caramel malt, because the manufacturing process in England is somewhat different from that in Germany, and as a result it produces quite different aromas. Really caramelly and even with some toffee notes. So it's super exciting. And here we have something known as chocolate malt, heavily roasted and to be added with care. You can see it has a very dark color. It lends chocolate aromas to the beer and ultimately also coffee.
By using special hops and varieties of malt, beer is brewed which differs markedly from the customary German beer in terms of flavor, but also in its alcohol content. It's not to everyone's taste. The fan community remains modest in size, and less than 2% of the beer drunk in Germany is craft beer.
Yes, this is where we got started. Mario and I brewed our first beers here. It's where we learned how to brew beer. It's still crazy to think that we now have a proper brewery, starting from this tiny operation. We only went about it as test brewing, just for drinking at home. It's still fun, but we don't get round to brewing on this tiny kit very often now.
It results in unusual flavors of beer, all carefully brewed and complying with the German purity law.
For us, craft beer doesn't mean stirring a brew with our chef's spoon to create some kind of romantic narrative, but wanted to consistently deliver the best quality. And with that aim in mind, new facilities such as those behind me are extremely important in enabling a beer to always taste the same. This is simply not possible with manual equipment and loads of manual operations.
And how do the major breweries view the growing offer of craft beers from all over the world? As competition?
The craft beer scene certainly brings something positive with it. People are talking about beer. Beer is the talk of the town, you could say. And this hype has a positive side effect. I'd say I'm a craft brewer too, and I say that because I am similarly passionate about what I do. And in terms of our skills, there is no difference between what I do and what a craft brewer does. Well, maybe our containers are a little bit bigger.
And not only that, in the traditional brewery, every process is controlled by computer. 3 employees monitor the entire brewing process at the heart of the brewery. The Sud House. It's where up to 1.5 million liters of beer are produced daily. The actual brewing process starts here in the Sud House or brew house. During the era of industrialization and the time when the big breweries were emerging, the vessels in the brew house were still made of copper. Today they're made of steel. The first unit is the mashing tun. Here the kibbled malt is mixed with brewing water and heated to up to 76 degrees Celsius. As it is being heated, the brewers allow the mash to stand at certain temperatures, known as resting.
During the resting times, the enzymes originally in the malt grain are activated, and these enzymes convert the starch from the malt grain in the mash into sugar. It's that sugar we need later on for the brewing process.
Just like the malt, the second raw material for the mash is similarly selected with particular care: the water. In terms of volume, it's the largest component in the beer. Water influences how long the beer will keep, for its ability to produce a head and even the flavor of the beer. The quality of brewing water is generally even higher than that of normal drinking water. To satisfy these requirements, in the side stream from its own source of brewing water, the brewery employs its smallest workers. Water fleas, known as Daphnia, are the initial tasters of the brewing water. Although they only grow to a size of between 2 and 6 millimeters, they have a major responsibility within the brewery.
The Daphnia are monitored here in a small photo cell, which in principle is like a tiny mini aquarium. A digital camera records the Daphnia. Software tracks their swimming behavior. And if their swimming behavior changes in that they are becoming less active, or alternatively hyperactive in order to escape a source of contamination, the software triggers an alarm. All the sliding gates are closed and the brewing water is immediately shut off from that point on.
The Daphnia always swim at the same pace against the current. If there are contaminants in the water, which they filter through their fine hairs, they either stop swimming or become hyperactive and swim even faster against the current. In both cases, the water feed is immediately stopped. Back to the brew house. In the mashing tun, the starch from the malt has been converted into sugar. Time for the next step. The mash is pumped out via pipes and into the lauter tun, or lauterbottisch.
The lauter tun serves to separate the solid from the liquid components. The tun has a sieve in its base, and the solids from the malt grain settle to the bottom and form a natural filter layer. The water runs through, dissolves the sugar and carries it off into the wort, which is the word used for it from that point on. The solids which are left on the sieve base are known as draff, which is sold to farmers as a high-quality animal feed.
We move to the test brewery to demonstrate the next brewing process on a smaller scale. After the lauter process, the brewer is left with a wort, which is then heated in the wort kettle. Brewer Michael Thon takes a sample to determine the original gravity of the wort. It is the original gravity which determines the beer's alcohol content.
The indicator is now showing an original gravity of 12.2%. OG is the proportion of dissolved sugar in the wort. As a rough guide, you can say that with 12 OG in the wort, you'll have 4% alcohol afterwards in the final beer.
While the wort cooks for around an hour, Michael Thon adds the hops. Hops make the beer bitter and give it its individual characteristic taste. The hop, the beer's soul. It enables the beer to be kept for longer and is also considered to be a remedy with a sedative effect. The world's largest contiguous area planted with hops is located in the Bavarian region of Hallertau. Hops have reportedly been growing here since the early Middle Ages, the time when the monasteries were also increasingly using hops for brewing. Through to today, monks have been considered pioneers in the art of brewing, driven by the Catholic stipulation of fasting before Easter.
The image of the beer-drinking monk was, of course, greatly hyped in the 19th century, including in photos, but in fact precisely for the days of fasting, when the intake of solids was reduced, and where there was a lower intake of fats and proteins, people needed fortifying nourishment, and there's a principle in church law that liquid sustenance does not break the fast. And of course, that was where the highly nutritious beer proved absolutely ideal.
While the hop was establishing itself in the monasteries as a popular added ingredient in brewing, in many secular breweries, the beer was instead being adulterated with added ingredients, which were often poisonous. Mushrooms, henbane, and other dangerous ingredients found their way into the brewing vessels. But in order for the hop to commence its ultimate triumphant ascent to victory, it needed the help of the secular nobility. The Bavarian Duke, William IV, issued a law on the 23rd of April 1516, prohibiting the addition of ingredients other than barley, water, and hops. His descendant, Prince Luitpold of Bavaria, brews beer in Schloss Kaltenberg. He would be king if there was still a monarchy in Bavaria. Here he stresses the importance of the purity law.
The Bavarian purity law was a law which, for the first time, clearly defined beer. That is to say, as a drink made of malt, hops, and water. And in doing so, on the one hand, it clarified the term itself, but it also protected consumers.
The original of the purity law, which William IV, one of the forefathers of Prince Luitpold, issued in 1516, has been preserved and is held today in the Bavarian State Archive. But it was not always known as the Reinheitsgebot. The term was first used in 1918 in the Bavarian parliament, and it gradually came into use beyond Bavaria too.
The purity law still applies today, throughout Germany, thank goodness. It was one of three conditions which Bavaria insisted on when it was accepted into or incorporated into the German Empire, that the purity law was extended to the rest of Germany.
Today, the purity law is anchored in the Provisional Beer Act of the Federal Republic of Germany. In the original wording of the decree of 1516, it was stated that in our towns and markets and in the countryside, in no beer shall more items than pure barley, hops and water be used. But why was there no mention of yeast? At that time, people were simply unaware that yeast is essential for the brewing process. However, yeast was generally in the air because brewing took place directly in bakeries or close to bakeries. And because in the Middle Ages baking was still exclusively undertaken by women, it was also women who were responsible for brewing the beer. It's only centuries later, when coffee was available for the general population, that beer becomes established as a man's drink and coffee as a drink for women.
I'm thinking of a Neuruppiner engraving, a Neuruppiner illustrated sheet dating from 1850, showing a man resolutely drinking beer, an ever-thirsty character known as Hans Immerdurst, and alongside him his wife, Frau Immerdurst, a born coffee lover. And that's precisely what has stuck in our heads through to today, beer as a man's drink.
And the reason the purity law specified that the beer brewing women of the time should only use barley for beer was because this tough grain was not suitable for baking. Rye and wheat were to be reserved for making bread.
People actually liked drinking wheat beer, but the right to make beer from wheat malt was reserved for the sovereign in Bavaria and in many other states.
Regardless whether it is wheat beer, dark beer or pils, all beers made and sold in Germany must be brewed in accordance with the purity law.
The purity law also allows for a massive variety of beers, but it demands hygienically perfect working, because you can't throw in chemicals to rescue a situation. In other countries, if you detect an infection, you can add in a little formaldehyde, and that takes care of the infection, and then it's diluted down a bit again, and those are the tricks you can use to help yourself out. And here, you simply can't do that.
Pure beer delight for the Germans. On average, each German drinks 106 litres of beer per year. But the purity law also permits a number of loopholes, which most people don't know about.
The purity law doesn't mean that it only has 4 ingredients and that's all that goes into a beer. Instead, you can also brew to comply with the purity law and, for example, use filtration aids or similar supplements in the brewing process, with these being filtered out again subsequently.
Variety in beers is also possible in Germany, despite the restrictions of the purity law. There are over 5,000 different varieties of beer in Germany. Theoretically, it means you could try a different German beer every day for 13.5 years. It could be Pils, Kölsch, Weissbier, Helles or Dunkles. There's something for every taste. And we discover a secret. While the purity law may be 500 years old, it wasn't always applied strictly, and only much later did Germany pay closer attention to compliance.
The fact that purity was not the main focus is evident in that added ingredients were allowed again in Bavaria a few decades later. Ingredients like juniper, caraway, coriander, bay leaves, you could add these to the mix again. In other words, the purity law has not enjoyed 500 years of continuity because quite different provisions have been handed down to us via state ordinances, dating from the 1560s and the early 17th century.
In the major brewery, we now reach the critical phase following the brewing process, maturation. After the water's been cooled down again, the yeast is added and it's pumped into the fermentation tanks, over 20 meters tall and 6 meters in diameter. Up to 4,200 hectolitres of beer fit into each tank. 420,000-litre jugs of beer in every one. Here, the yeast converts the sugar in the wort into carbon dioxide and, most importantly, into alcohol. After 7 days, fermentation is complete and the yeast is drawn off again.
At the time the purity law was written, people knew what the yeast did, but not that it was the yeast that was doing it. In other words, that the yeast was subsequently converting the sugar in the malt into alcohol. In those times, the breweries were situated close to bakeries, and so the yeast was airborne, did its job, and contributed massively to the taste of the beer.
Before it starts on the maturation phase, the beer, now termed Jungbier, is subjected to careful laboratory examination. Brewer Michael Thon readies everything needed for taking a sample from one of the fermentation tanks. Here, once more, there is strict adherence to the high hygiene regulations. No alien bacteria can be allowed to intrude into the brewing process, otherwise it would be the end of the road for this green beer. Which is why Michael Thon disinfects everything thoroughly before taking his sample. In the central laboratory, over 30 employees continuously monitor the quality of the beer.
Hi, Annette, could you check this sample for me, please?
The samples are given barcodes to enable precise tracking of tank, date, and sampling time. The tests employ technical equipment to measure alcohol and original gravity, pH, and bitterness rating, amongst others. Despite the high-tech equipment, here too there is a role for the experienced brewer. Specially trained staff use simple stopwatches to time how long it takes for the head to dissipate, and they check the cloudiness of the beer and also its taste.
So Unit 3, from the time viewpoint, I'd say this is absolutely okay. 2 minutes, 10 seconds, so I'd rate this a 2.3.
I agree, 2.3.
As for aroma and taste, they were typically normal.
Okay, typical. Head? The head was good?
Yes, you can approve this brew.
Will you approve it?
Yeah, I'll do it.
As well as the visual check, the persistence of the head is also checked with a meter, because the foaming properties say a lot about the quality of the beer. The density and duration of the head is determined by the type of malt and its fermentation. The persistence of the foam is influenced on the technological side by the various mashing procedures and the source of the grain. Several sensors measure precisely how long the head takes to collapse by 3 centimeters.
Okay, that's the end of the foam metering. The foaming values are around 326 seconds, which is excellent. We aim for 280 seconds, and we've more than achieved that.
With its head of foam, a beer tastes especially good, and particularly in one of the countless beer gardens. Because brewing was only possible in the cool of winter, the breweries built beer cellars and planted horse chestnut trees to keep the brewing beer cool through the summer. They sold their beer directly to the customers, which led to a dispute between the publicans and the breweries.
The Bavarian king Max I was the father of the beer gardens. In his day, he allowed the beer gardens, the large beer cellars in Munich above the Isar River, to sell beer there, although he specified that they were not allowed to sell food. The result of this, right through to today, is that it is customary in Munich for the beer gardens to sell beer, but for visitors to be allowed to bring along their own food. You can't imagine Bavaria without beer, and it has remained a very important part of the Bavarian way of life and of Bavarian culture.
It's not just in Bavaria that beer has been the #1 popular drink over centuries, but there was also a time when the image of beer suffered.
In many parts of the German Empire, it stopped being a drink for the educated, for the elite, and particularly in the 18th century, as new fashionable beverages came onto the market, primarily coffee and tea, but also spirits. But that led to veritable excesses involving alcohol, schnapps, bringing about rapid intoxication, the beverage of industrialization, so to speak. Nothing like this gradual intoxication which you find with beer.
The authorities sought to combat this new phenomenon. So, in around 1830, Germany saw the emergence of temperance societies with a mission to restore beer to its earlier higher standing in society.
These were temperance societies which were not advocating complete abstinence, but whose message was, don't drink schnapps, drink beer. Even the science of the time believed that there was not just one kind of alcohol, but, putting it simply, there is good alcohol, which is in beer, and there is bad alcohol, which is in schnapps.
And this image campaign proved effective. With this newly acquired good image, beer also became an industrially produced mass product during the era of industrialization. Using steam power, it was possible to produce beer without worrying about the effort involved and in large quantities. New transport options accelerated logistics. For instance, the first railway journey in Germany from Fürth to Nuremberg traveled with a special cargo on board, 2 barrels of beer. And with the invention of the refrigeration machine by Carl von Linde, it now became possible to brew bottom-fermented beer all year round. To explain that term, top fermentation yeast works at high temperatures, and during the fermentation process it settles to the top of the beer wort. Conversely, bottom fermentation yeast needs low temperatures and settles to the bottom. Prior to the invention of the refrigeration machine, bottom fermentation brewing was only possible during the winter, and the brewing also required frozen lakes close to the brewery. Blocks of ice were sawn from the lake and broken free using ice tongs. The ice blocks were transported to the storage cellar to keep the beer cool right into the springtime. This is also the origin of Märzenbier.
Märzenbier, derived from the German word for March, was not a beer which was first brewed in March. Rather, it is a beer brewed during the winter to be kept in store because ice was available, so that it could be sold and drunk in March. The beer was mature, it was fermented and stored.
Industrialization not only replaced manual filling of the bottles with machines, but even changed how the bottles themselves were sealed.
Bottled beer became a mass phenomenon following patenting of the attractive snap closer in the 1870s. It also meant that the consumption pattern changed. Before then, you would fetch your beer for the day from the inn in a jug, but now you could keep some beer in store at home. Naturally, that changed how beer was consumed.
Not slapstick comedy from 1910, but everyday life. Children are sent off to bring back a jug of beer for their father, and it was equally usual and socially acceptable for children to be seen drinking beer. In the early 20th century, the beer business was booming. The breweries are engines of progress, now producing on a large scale and in consistent quality in their brick-built castles to beer. Balance of trade figures from the period around 1900 even show that the brewing sector had a higher turnover than metal smelting or the coal industry. More and more can be produced, so there needs to be more and more sales. Beer makes its entry into the world of advertising, initially with collective adverts, sometimes making claims for the effects of beer which today we would consider highly questionable.
In rural areas, we read in nutrition advice and in medical writings well into the 19th century and even into the 20th century that beer is the ideal nourishment for men engaged in hard physical work, and also for those who are ill, and for breastfeeding mothers. Only last week, someone told me that when his child was being born in 1970, the nurses asked him to put a crate of beer next to the bed for his wife.
We are meeting up with advertising psychologist Dr. Kai Feser from Munich University's Human Science Center.
Warsteiner, Warsteiner,
Warsteiner,
Warsteiner, Warsteiner Pilsner aus der uralten Kaiserquelle. Unbestrittene Qualität aus dem Sauerland.
The history of beer advertising is naturally the history of advertising itself. To start with, we had these curiously appealing short films.
Sie weiß, dass ihr Mann tagsüber angestrengt zu arbeiten hat. Und da zeigt sie sich gerne erkenntlich. Die größte Freude aber bereitet die aufmerksame Frau ihm mit einer Flasche Leibinger Bier. Das weiß sie. Und das hält sie schon immer so.
Männer wie wir, Wickkühler-Bier. Wickkühler schmeckt aus der Flasche so gut wie vom Fass.
Becks Bier löscht Männerdurst.
Löwenbräu alkoholfrei.
Ein schöner Tag, die Welt steht still, ein schöner Tag. Komm Welt, lass mich umarmen, welch
ein Tag mit freundlichen Diebels.
Earlier on, people thought that you could manipulate people through advertising, so something maybe with green sailing ships or lions or, above all, plenty of blue in the background, for example, blue skies overhead. The expert view back then was that this creates internal images. But it creates nothing. Nothing at all. Instead, beer advertising can work in one of three ways. Firstly, Krombacher, making the same adverts for over 30 years. And it works because it doesn't work. In other words, the advertising is unobtrusive. It can't be obtrusive, and that is precisely the trick. Somehow I still take it in, and it feels so familiar that when I'm standing in front of the shelf, I find myself saying, okay, Krombacher. But not in a manipulative way, but to help me out in this sea of possibilities. The Astra approach is entirely the opposite. It says I'm looking for advertising which tells a story that is so different from those of the other beers that it absolutely stands out. But in that case, it mustn't only stand out, but it needs to entertain me again and again. And Astra advertising does that. Because it's ironic, because it's humorous, and because the mental exercise of decoding these jokes is pleasurable. That's clever. Because the beer has a popular appeal and I don't want to lose that. Instead, I ramp up that appeal and reach an even wider public. That worked brilliantly. The third approach is to say, I'm not advertising at all. That way, the advertising doesn't provoke any adverse reaction. I can rely on the fact that somatic markers are being formed. Somatic markers mean I'm emotionally very contented, enjoying a beer with friends, and that beer is an Augustiner. Out of the corner of my eye, I can see the label, which hasn't changed in 300 years, and every time I see it again, I unconsciously recall these beautiful moments. That could work too. The single important thing is that I associate a label with an emotional event. It works, and it works without me needing to advertise. On the contrary, if I were to advertise, that would threaten this effect, and it would also cost money.
We are back in the major brewery in the Sauerland. Once the beer has been matured in the storage tanks at a temperature of around 0 degrees Celsius for roughly 3 weeks, it's filtered here in a number of stages. It's the final manufacturing stage before the beer is bottled. Filtering.
The beers being filtered flow through the filter cellar here. In the background, they flow through some pre-filters, and as a final filter, before the beers go for bottling, they pass through what is called a multi-layer filter. The filter layers you can see here are cellulose layers, and that cellulose layer traps any final yeast cells possibly remaining in the beer, so that the beer can then be sent for bottling and bottled clean and clear, just as the customer likes it, particularly for Pilsner beer.
But does whether it's filtered or not really tell you anything about the quality of the beer?
Whether a beer is filtered or not doesn't really say anything about the quality of the beer. It's a question of character, the character you want to give the beer. Pilsner beers are generally filtered and are clear. Cellar beers are generally naturally cloudy, and accordingly they are not filtered. But it doesn't tell you anything about the quality of the beer.
Before the final bottling, there is a final tasting, in the major brewery and in the small brewery alike. After filtering, a beer which has been brewed using a new recipe is being tasted in the test brewery.
Maybe that's another small difference between beer and wine. Generally, I don't swallow wine, but with beer, the bitter note plays an important role. And in his wisdom, God saw fit to place the bitterness receptors very far back on the tongue, and so it simply has to go the natural way down.
there's worse things.
Exactly.
These are no typical beer glasses used during the tasting. They're more reminiscent of wine glasses. But there is a reason for that.
Firstly, you need to be clear, so then you can assess the color and the head, and then it's also important to have plenty of room at the top for gases, for the aromatics which are released by swirling the beer, so that you can take these in without sticking your nose right into the glass and smell everything even above the top of the glass. That's the first impression you get when drinking beer, and these glasses are ideal for that.
Today, the testing is done with high tech as well as with the eye and the palate. But in earlier times, there were other clever methods for tasting beer.
In the old days, there used to be something known as the Lederhosen test. That was how visitors to inns in earlier times checked whether the original gravity in the beer was adequate. The first glass was tipped onto the bench, and when you needed to stand up again after a couple of hours drinking, the bench should stick to the drinker's leather trousers, his Lederhosen. If it didn't, the innkeeper had a problem because he had too much water in his beer. That was the kind of test people used earlier on. Today, things are done very differently.
New test beers are constantly being brewed in the company's own test brewery. Sometimes this is to try out ingredients from new suppliers, because the customer's expectation of his favorite beer is that it will always taste the same, in summer and in winter, year after year. But trials are also conducted on new varieties of beer. If the test beer passes all its tests, it's now finally ready for bottling. We have a small quantity of our test beer bottled.
So that's the first bottle filled. Now I'll simply force the oxygen out of the neck of the bottle.
The bottle should contain as little oxygen as possible because it affects the taste and can cause the beer to taste like cardboard, as people sometimes say.
There, that's the first bottle of our new beer filled.
There are over 5,000 different beers in Germany. To get an overview, Lukas Bulker at Munich's Beer and Oktoberfest Museum offers a beer tasting to show his visitors something of the differences between the types of beer. That means helles, dunkles, wheat beer, pils, and so on.
So here we have a comparison between two classic beers, a pale beer, a helles, and a dark beer, a dunkles. So you can already see this in the color. Both are 100% brewed with barley, a bottom fermented beer. And the dark beer simply uses roasted malt, hence the dark color. And as you already mentioned, it tastes very malty. You can also smell something of this roasted aroma. This is because the barley malt has been roasted for longer and at a higher heat, which is why this color and this roasted taste come through.
These test drinkers slowly feel their way, using their nose, eyes, and the tongue's taste buds.
So number 3 is a typical wheat beer, as is indicated by the name in German, Weissbier or Weizenbier. In addition to the barley, there's an element of wheat included, around 50%. And this one is a top fermented beer. In other words, it uses a different kind of yeast. This yeast needs a warmer temperature for fermentation, and it takes only around 3 days. Typically of this beer, it hasn't been filtered, meaning it holds more flavor. And with that, cheers. Someone mentioned banana earlier. This is a typical indicator for this top fermented wheat beer. It's precisely through a chemical reaction that this banana-like flavor and the carnation-like aromas come about.
It's advisable not to drive a car following the beer tasting.
It's got a summery taste.
Yes, really refreshing.
Okay, now we have a round of special beer. This brings us to stark beer, strong beer. It has a pungent smell, and here we have a very compact head. This beer has a high original gravity, so the quantity of dissolved substances is higher. There's more malt in it, so the yeast also has a bit more sugar for fermentation. And in terms of alcohol content, this beer is also significantly higher. The previous beers were all at around 5%, whereas these beers are always between 7.5 and 8%, so it tastes good, but is always a bit sneaky with it.
it's not just the percentage of alcohol in this Einbecker beer which tells a tale. The story of how this beer came about is full of adventure.
Einbeck in Lower Saxony was the source of one of the most important types of beer in the late Middle Ages and even into the 16th century, just as the north of the country as a whole played a major role in brewing beer in Germany at that time. Einbecker beer was dispatched right across Scandinavia and was also appreciated in central and southern Germany. It was a very strong brewed beer in order for it to survive these long land transport routes. The Duke in Munich, the Bavarian Duke, William V in fact, was a particular enthusiast for Einbecker beer, which for him was truly a luxury item on account of this long journey by land. And people were not keen on the idea of money permanently flowing out of the state. For that reason, efforts were undertaken in the ducal brewhouse to imitate this beer. And they were successful. And they then called this Einbeckisch Bier, ein Böckisch Bier, ein Bockisch Bier, and at some point a misunderstanding arose, to the effect that the name had something to do with Bock, the German word for a buck, a male deer, which is how Einbecker beer became Bock beer, a name that describes a particularly strong beer, like this beer from Einbeck.
They don't bottle Einbecker beer, but they bottle all kinds of other types of beer in our major brewery. And that brings us to the final station, the bottling plant. Before the beer can be filled into the bottles, the empty bottles first need to be prepared. Most breweries use their own different deposit-paid bottles and crates. The crates with the empty bottles are scanned for color, shape, and relief markings. Bottles from other manufacturers are removed by a fully automated sorting machine. Recycling is definitely a good thing, but it takes an effort. And so, despite all the new technology with a price tag running into millions, the human eye still needs to cast a final look over the containers to remove any bottles sporting another's trademark. The bottles are moved on, out of the crate, up onto the conveyor belt. The first station on their route to the filler unit is the rinsing machine. Here the bottles are thoroughly cleaned and the old labels are removed. What emerges are blank bottles which all look the same and which still have to pass a few more tests on the conveyor belt as they advance towards the finishing straight. The empty bottles are checked for damage, contamination, or residual fluids by a fault sensor. Defective bottles are immediately rejected. Now the bottles can be filled. Up to 50,000 bottles per hour are filled on a single filling unit. A small injection of water causes the beer to foam over, thus driving out the excess oxygen. Then the crown cap is placed over the top, and another sensor measures whether any bottle contains too much or too little beer and rejects any incorrectly filled bottles. The filled and capped bottles now have a label applied, indicating the precise time and date of filling. An employee checks the labels for correct positioning, correct adhesion, and the date. Every half hour, the employee takes off sample bottles. In total, 5,000 samples are taken every day, labeled with a barcode and archived. In each case, in a refrigerated store and in a store at room temperature.
Using this barcode, we can track the batch of crown caps we've used, for example, and of course the batch of labels used. And working in the other direction, we can trace the pressurized tank, the storage tank, the fermentation tank, and back to the brewhouse where you were earlier, and to the batches of malt, the batches of water we used, and the hops.
The bottles are sorted into crates for onward transport to the distributors and then to customers. But it's not only bottles which get filled in the brewery. Over 1,000 beer barrels and up to 50,000 cans are filled here per hour too. But which packaging is actually best for beer?
Naturally, no light gets into a can. So in terms of the effects of light on certain hop components in beers brewed under the purity law, it makes a can the perfect container. And maybe so with regard to other requirements too. A can is very light, can be refrigerated very easily and quickly, and if we are talking about an aluminium can, which is state-of-the-art here, then this kind of packaging is 100% recyclable.
That also used to be the case in around 1900. Back then, though, it wasn't aluminium cans, but large barrels in durable wood. To keep the barrels sealed, however, they had to be regularly treated with pitch. The pitch is poured inside the barrel and turned back and forth until an even covering is achieved. This seal prevents bacteria from taking hold in the cracks in the wood and spoiling the beer. On the outside too, the barrels are also thoroughly cleaned before they set off on their onward journey, by horse and cart to the railway depot. In those days, beer was certainly good business for the hauliers. Back to the present-day bottling. There are no giant wooden barrels, but the crates are collected by the pallet load using the forklifts and loaded onto the trucks. Beer is a German export triumph. Last year, 1.4 billion litres of beer were exported. The top 3 destinations are EU countries. 20% of beer goes to Italy, 12% to France, and 11% to the Netherlands. 4th place in the export listing goes to China with 10%, and then comes the USA with just over 7%. Exported German beer is generally shipped by container. Containers of beer are even dispatched around the whole world, setting off by goods train from stations located in the breweries themselves and travelling via ports in Hamburg, Bremerhaven and Rotterdam. German beer exports bring in sales of 1.1 billion euros per year. German beer, a success story for 500 years.